Okay, right off the bat, I want to thank you all for your patience on this album review. I know that this album dropped like 2 or 3 weeks ago, but I had a lot of albums that I wanted to really digest and get into, and I wanted to make sure that I gave this album its proper due because, man, there's a lot going on here that I want to talk about, and I wanted to make sure that I had enough listens under my belt. I also, I didn't want to let this album go. So I knew that the moment I would put out a review, I'd be just like right on to the next album review. So yeah, I also know that there's another album that dropped this past weekend that I need to get to, so I wanted to make sure that I got this album review out first before I tackled old SW over there. So yeah, let's finally dive into this one. War of Being by TesseracT. So, TesseracT is a British progressive metal band and one of the pioneers of the djent movement. And it's funny because we were listening to this up at the family cottage a couple weekends ago, and my dad's saying, like, what kind of music is this? And I, spend a couple of minutes describing what djent was, and I said, it's djent and this is what it is. And he was just like, so you couldn't just say funky, bottom, experimental, strange metal? And I'm like, well, that's not a bad moniker for it. So yeah, this is also like the second big release from a djenty band that has been on my radar. Periphery's album earlier this year really knocked me out. I really enjoyed that one. And I was actually more excited for TesseracT's album because I'm more of a TesseracT fanboy than I am a Periphery one. I got my start back in their Polaris days, and I really love that one. I went back and I listened to one in Altered State and just really fell in love with the band. I loved their experimental, playing styles within the djent genre. The one thing that I really love about them is their being okay with experimenting and just trying to see if it works. That was kind of my one kind of drawback to Sonder, their last album, because I wasn't as much of a fan of Sonder. I probably returned to that album the least amount of all their albums thus far. So I was cautiously optimistic for War of Being, and when they released, the big track, the 11-minute title track, I was immediately hooked. I love the aggression. I love the fact that Daniel Tompkins is once again just screaming his balls off, and I love that from some of the earlier albums. And I know that some fans were a little hesitant about that, but I embraced it. I loved it. And I love the fact that there is so much aggression found back onto this album. One of the things that I didn't necessarily connect with all that much with Sonder was how somber it was. There wasn't this big explosion. There wasn't this big oomph. And I feel like War of Being brought that back in much to its advantage. So all the boys are here. We have Ankle, Canhe on lead guitars, rhythm guitars, and bass. We have Jay Ponstones on drums and percussions. James Monetheth, I think, on rhythm guitars. Amos Williams on bass, growls, backing vocals. So it looks like Amos is doing most of the growls on this one, not Daniel. But Daniel's doing the main vocals on there. And that's why you come to Notes Reviews, because I probably butchered most of their names. I have been loving this record, in my mind, because at this point, Polaris was always my favorite. I always loved Polaris. Maybe Polaris is going to take a back seat. I think Polaris might be taking a back seat. What I love from this album, as I mentioned at the top, is how immediate, how aggressive it is. And I also feel as if this is the natural progression for djent music going forward. I did feel as if, djent was so big within the 2010s that I almost felt like the 2020s were probably going to see it phased out and a lot of these djenty bands moving on. Now, Periphery showed that that wasn't the case with djent is not a genre, but I was wondering what TesseracT was going to do, and in my love, they continued it forward in a natural progression. You know, this feels as if they're taking the next steps. They're doing what needs to be done within Gent. And we still have those really bouncy things I love with Gent, you know, that that very slappy bass, that very slappy and rhythmic guitar works. I really love and appreciate that aspect of it. But they're doing some really fun and very exciting things on this album as well. You know, right from the get-go, the first couple of notes in Natural Disaster, I knew I was in for something really, really fun. After I had devoured the War of Being within that 11-minute just odyssey of music within that stretch. But coming into the album proper, Natural Disaster opens up perfectly. You know, we have this little bit of a bass line, a little bit of that usual gentiness, and then that aggression, that intensity, that explosion of sound right at the very beginning. And then it comes into the track proper, and we have this very soothing, very like wishing in the waves kind of an aspect of it that it makes me melt. This is continued with echoes within that same kind of ebb and flow, and I love the peaks and the valleys within this. You know, we have these breakdowns, we have these kind of slower movements, we have these little bit of atmosphere to kind of pad the song and give us a little bit of context before it explodes once again, and I love the journey, and I love all the different nooks and crannies on this. One of the things that I also really appreciate and love are the little bits of padding between the track propers. You know, I remember on physical compact discs, like physical CDs, you would have these like little interlude tracks that would count down the runtime for the next track, and it would just be like these little hidden tracks. And I love the fact that TesseracT are kind of doing this without doing it, you know, because there's little paddings between tracks to make it feel much more like a cohesive flow between the music. The Graze follows all this up with the third track, and it's it's funny. If I were to distill the most TesseracT-y TesseracT track, I would probably point to the Graze. You know, we have that bounce within the guitars, we have that really quick syncopated playing styles within the guitars and the bass and the drumming, with quite a brilliant synth that just kind of levels throughout the track overall. And yeah, it's no surprise that people are really coming to this one, and it was no surprise that this was the second track that they used as promotional material for this album. Now, Legion is one of those tracks that I feel like this is kind of where the future of Gent is going to go. It's a little bit more atmospheric. It has a little bit more of just a vibe check to it rather than like this very immediate and very meaty aspect to it. And I love that they're able just to kind of take a little bit of a breath after the Graze and before we get into Tender. Tender is an exercise in restraint. You know, I love that we are continuing this little bit of a somber moment, but it feels as if the tension is just tightening as the track progresses, because I love just how the coils begin to tighten as the song progresses, and by the end of it, it's so tight and so technical that I could not move, and then they just explode, you know, and they explode in such a beautiful and wonderful way. And then we move on to the War of Being, which I've already gushed about already. Let's move on to Sirens, which kind of does the same thing that Tender and Legion did, as being a little bit of a come down, a little bit of a breath of fresh air before we get into Burden. And Burden might be my second favorite track after the War of Being because of just how well placed this track is. Once again, it's that build, and this is one of the things that I love with TesseracT are their ability to build up a track. Much like Tender, we have this very gradual climb, this very gradual build until we get to the end, and it is just like I feel myself crippled over the burden of this track, you know, and I love it. It's so layered very, very well. The mixing on this track is so well done. I can't gush about it more. And then we come to the final track of Sacrifice. You know, the final track off of this album, and it was such a joy. You know, it's both in your face, but also reserved. It's restrained while also wild and free. And it's what I come to TesseracT for. It's a perfect way of ending this album overall. So, like, in some cases, this album is very interesting because it starts off very, very aggressive and very intense and in your face, and then it gets very atmospheric and very vibe-like near the middle, only to be built back up again into this very aggressive and very intense explosion of sound to finally come down off of that into a very pleasant and very atmospheric ending. It almost follows the wave that most of these tracks have. very atmospheric at the beginning and an explosion near the middle to end to kind of come down into a very pleasant and very beautiful ending. So yeah, this is an album that I've been coming back to quite regularly, and I've always found something very exciting and very fun to enjoy. I think that this is probably the most mature and the strongest album that TesseracT has put out, and it may have knocked Polaris off of my favorite TesseracT album run, and that really goes to show just the mastercraft of this group. I'm really excited to see where this band goes from here, but for now, I will say War of Being from TesseracT is one I would absolutely pick up in physical format. There's a lot to love about this album. This is going to satisfy both fans and newcomers to the band alike. I think we're going to see a lot of new fans to TesseracT coming in because of this album, and I've already kind of seen it. I think this is a really good onboarding for the gent style, for anybody that's new to the genre, wants to get their feet wet a little bit without being like overly saturated with the techniques and the styles of the genre. Because there's a lot of atmosphere and just vibes for it. But I think it also satisfies those diehard fans of the group. This is them taking what people love, expanding on it, and moving forward. It's not just a carbon copy of something that they've done in the past. There's something new and rejuvenating about this album that I really, really love. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on the War of Being from TesseracT. What did you guys think about this album? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. Because, yeah, that's all I've got for today. Once again, thank you all for your patience on this one. I know that this is coming out, 3 weeks after it was originally released, but I needed those 3 weeks to really digest and really get into this album, so I really appreciate your patience within this. Now, without further ado, I'm going to go and dive deep into the Steven Wilson album that just dropped this past weekend. So, wish me luck on that one. But yeah, let me know of your own thoughts about this album, if you loved it, if you hated it, by commenting down below. I already said that. I can move on from there. I'm going to say thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.